You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The conversation you're about to join was inspired by our Fall 2023 sermon series, In the Wilderness. In this sermon series, we're walking with the Israelites from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land and looking at what we can learn about trusting God more, even when the journey looks different than we anticipated or expected. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
That was less dramatic as anticipated.
I don't think a whole nation of people could have drank that much water, Jeremy.
That's why God multiplies it. Come on, Scott. Ye of little faith. Come on. Our giveaway.
Yeah. Congratulations, Tim
Rambo.
No. Congratulations,
No nepotism here.
Tina and Linda.
Yeah.
You have won.
So this morning, this Sunday morning, we came into quite a chilly building. I thought that it was just the upstairs last Wednesday when I noticed it, but apparently it's the whole church. And so I was very happy because I run hot, and so I was very, very comfortable and everything. But I know that it was frustrating for some.
I was glad I wore a jacket.
Yeah.
to preach on Sunday.
Imagine if you had to go all the way back home to find one.
I know, it would have been so far. No, I just felt bad for people who weren't prepared for it and maybe didn't dress for the weather. But God still met us.
Yeah, and I think it was very timely because of the frustration that it caused, and then preaching on trusting God.
Really, I just planned the whole thing, and we'll tell people next week that it was all just a big exercise in frustration.
Yeah. That's going to go so great, Scott.
I know.
No, but the story that you were using as the foundation for your sermon was in Numbers chapter 20 with Moses hitting the rock and letting out water for the people after they complained to him. But in this time, God asked him to speak and have water pour from the rock. And so he got in trouble with God, and God got frustrated with him.
Everybody was frustrated.
It was a very frustrating situation. And so it can seem from our perspective that God set Moses up for failure because he told him to take the staff. And that's what Moses used before, as you mentioned in Exodus, to get water out of a rock. And so why would you take the staff if you don't need the staff to make it happen?
Short answer, because it had become the symbol of Moses' authority to the people. That staff was the symbol that God had chosen him to lead the people. And from the very first encounter that God had with Moses at the burning bush, he used that staff to validate him as the leader and as God's own representative to Pharaoh, to the people, to the leaders. And so for him to take that staff, I feel like was very appropriate.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, though, this is where the answer gets a little longer. Everywhere else that God tells Moses to take the staff or use the staff, he tells him exactly what to do with it. Right? So when they face the Amalekites, he tells him, go up on the hill and hold up the staff over the battle. When they're at the Red Sea, God says, take the staff and stretch it out over the waters, and the waters parted. The first time, Exodus 17, that they're thirsty, God says, take the staff and strike the rock. This time, he says, take the staff and speak to the rock.
Yeah.
Doesn't tell him he's supposed to do anything with the staff except for have it as that visual symbol.
Yeah, and I even had some people make comments about, well, if I was frustrated, I would have hit the rock more than 2 times. I would have just kept whacking at it.
Sure. I might have hit some of the people, but
the rebels.
Yeah, you rebels, knock. And someone came up to me after the first service and said, that the church they grew up in was very big on typology, which
What
is...
does that mean?
which is seeing pictures of Christ in Old Testament figures and happenings.
Yeah.
And so similar to how Paul in 1 Corinthians says the rock was Christ. He said that in their church growing up, they taught that the rock couldn't be struck twice because Christ was only struck once in his affliction on the cross.
What do you mean he was only struck once on the cross? Are they referring to the spear through the ribs?
No. Like he only died once. He only suffered once. He only
okay.
not literally struck
the
once,
whippings
but
was way more than two.
Sure.
So that's like leading up to.
Yeah, but the idea that his suffering happened once and for all.
Okay.
So the rock could only be struck once. That's why God told him to speak to the rock. Similar, like because Christ suffered once, we can go and speak to Christ.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, hey, if it's fruitful for you, then that's great. I'm gonna have to chew on that one for a little bit. But you mentioned it was funny because you were asking people about if they'd ever been thirsty, and Rebecca and I raised our hands pretty high.
Pretty high. Why was that, Jeremy?
And then we just kept like nodding our heads to everything you were saying. Because for those that don't know, I don't think I mentioned it from the pulpit, have I?
I'm pretty sure you did, didn't you?
So, Rebecca and myself and a couple of my cousins and a couple of friends went backpacking in the Grand Canyon 2 summers ago. And it was like my second time. My third time, Rebecca's second time. That's where I ended up proposing to Rebecca. But on this trip, multiple circumstances led to us getting off trail and stranded in the Grand Canyon.
So long story short, you guys got stuck. You ran out of water.
Yeah, we ended up living off the last 48 hours was off like 4 sips of water per person. And so we know thirsty very, very well. I've learned all the pro tricks for the whole, I don't know if you ever heard as a kid, I remember hearing like the people in desert countries, they put rocks in their mouth to stimulate saliva.
Yeah.
It's crap. It's complete crap. Doesn't do anything. Don't put rocks in your mouth. Does not do anything. But my highest recommendation is Cliff Bars makes these gels, these energy gels.
Uh-huh.
And they dissolve really slowly if you don't chew into them, if you just suck on them. So you can get like a good 30 minutes of saliva stimulation with one of
like
those.
The gummy ones?
Yeah, the gummy squares.
Because they also make like a liquid
No,
gel.
not the tube paste, the like gummies. And those were our best friends in those days, especially during the heat of the day when, you're just, we were there in August, so it's summer in the desert.
How did it feel to be that thirsty?
That's one of the weirder things that I think we were more blessed with. So common symptoms, dry mouth, obviously, headaches, migraines, whatever, nausea, fatigue are like the common ones. We mainly just had dry mouth on and off through the day, and some headaches that would come and go, but nothing really, really intense until after we had a helicopter come down and we knew that it could see us. It wasn't just one of the many that was passing over for all those days. Our brains started to tell us that water was nearby, and therefore you're thirsty. Let me tell the rest of your body now that you're thirsty, because before our brains were protecting us in survival mode, and then once it thought water was nearby, started telling our bodies. And so then almost instantaneously, the fatigue, the nausea, the headaches, extreme cotton mouth, all of these things started piling up to the point that I ended up just laying on a bed of rocks while we waited. And even when things started getting better, we had a park ranger coming down, and Rebecca was kind of emotionally vomiting, is what I call all the buildup from all that time, and then just letting it out. I couldn't even go over and physically console her because of just how drained I was. And so it was the closest thing to dying I think I've ever experienced. And but it's also crazy on the flip side, once your body gets water, shoots right back up. So once we got a liter in us, was ready to hike however many miles and just keep things going like nothing ever happened. And just the drastic shift in your entire body and everything you're doing in your mind, how everything functions once you have just a little bit of that water. And so I don't take water for granted. Now I'm getting thirsty just talking about this.
What'd you learn about God through that experience?
Oh, I don't know if we have enough time for that whole experience. But for that part in relation to water, I think that I didn't realize how important, physiologically, how important water was for everything else that you do. Like, yes, we were short on water, but we had food for 4 or 5 days. So you think, oh, well then, there's some sustenance.
But was it all that freeze-dried stuff you had to add water to cook?
Some of it, but not all of it,
Okay,
actually.
all
We had
right.
a lot of bars. We had a lot of things that didn't require that because with the amount of people we had, we didn't want to take the time to cook for every single meal for every single person, take up all that time. And so, but when you're that dehydrated, your body can't or doesn't want to intake any more food. So we ended up only taking in about 500 calories a day per person because otherwise you get nauseous just from eating more food. And we separated things out with more sodium, less sodium, so that we weren't dehydrating ourselves more with the food we were taking in. But about God, there was just such a shift in how I viewed being in regular relationship with him, in the sense of I had a friend that made it much more clear for me when I got to visit him preaching about the water and the living water, and he got all these pitchers out, and he would give a cup and say, okay, so you did a morning prayer, did a little splash of water into that, or you did a Bible study devotional and prayer and like gave a whole jug and you get like a liter in there, and all of these pitchers are like slowly pouring out as we're like going through the day. Sunday morning, get a nice big glass, all of these things. But the last one was, if we're going to have the living water and we're in constant relationship with him, he put a hose into that pitcher and then had that constantly outpouring, because all the others could run dry depending on how much they're pouring out.
Sure.
And so in regards to like our relationship with God, of like, if I'm doing the bare minimum, my relationship with him can't even survive off of 2 sips a day of metaphorical water. But to just have a constant flow of that time and that relationship with God throughout the day and throughout the week, to have that sustaining, and then I'm getting more than I need to the point that it's overflowing. And we've talked a lot about the outpouring of that time. But it really clicked with me more then, but also just how precious water is in general, and how God's provided that need for us. And we don't have to walk mile up and down mountains to get the only well for the entire town and wait in line for an hour to get water twice a day. Like, our day isn't consumed around or like scheduled around getting water for our family.
Yeah.
Because it's just so readily accessible to us. And so one of the weirder things coming out of the canyon was that we got put up in a little cabin thing, and the people that were sitting outside were like, what's it like to sleep in a real bed again? I was like, I could care less. I wanted a backpack. I knew I wasn't going to be in a real bed for 4 nights. That was the plan. It was the taking a shower was the weirdest part of adjusting back into normal society.
Yeah. To watch all that water just running down the drain.
And not consuming any of it.
Yeah.
Like, the purpose of it wasn't for survival and nourishment. It was just play water, essentially. And that was really hard after, like, conserving every single thing that we had for days, to then just let multiple liters go down in 10 minutes was a very large adjustment for us. And so that is one of the things that I think can also translate in the sense of like how much of God's word and time of worship, or in a worship service, or even times of prayer, especially when we get into like repetitive ones that we don't necessarily put our heart into, are we just letting the water like wash away, like it's around us, and we're just letting it go right down the drain, kind of like in one ear, out the other, instead of consuming it and let it really fill us. That was really, really touching. And then I proceeded. I've got worse because I just haven't been close to the situation for a couple of years now. But for a while, I was drinking probably 3 liters a day, which for most people might not be a lot. But I was doing like a liter a week prior to that trip. Rebecca would always, she's like, I don't know how you're alive. You drink almost no water all week long. But that's definitely become more important physically, but then also spiritually since then.
So, Jeremy, in the midst of all that in the Grand Canyon, like, who were you frustrated at? Were you frustrated at, like, whoever steered you off the path? Were you frustrated at yourself for not packing more water? Were you frustrated with God that you were even in that situation? Who were you frustrated with?
I was not expecting that one. But I was frustrated with my navigational skills. It was the first time I was on that trail. Essentially, the permit office recommended that we take this one instead of the one I'd been on twice before. And it wasn't necessarily that I got us lost because there was a rock slide and that like messed up the trail, and that's why we couldn't.
Sure.
But frustrated with myself that I wasn't some pro expert navigator in the Grand Canyon, even though I had my cousin who is in the National Guard and has all training in that. And it was decided by both of us that it was better to just stay still. We had better chances than risking time and energy with the things that we had, because we were still 4 or 5 miles away from the closest water source. Yeah. So any time and energy you exert that isn't going in that direction makes it harder for you to actually get there. So I was really frustrated with myself and had a lot of guilt during that time. And when we eventually tried to send my cousin out to go get help, and I was helping her carry her pack up the rock slide, I started to have a couple panic attacks. And one of them was the realization that I'd brought everybody into the canyon, or like pitched the idea and that. And then halfway up the rock slide, realized that like I physically could not get us out of the situation if I tried myself. Yeah. And so feeling like I kind of brought everyone to die. So I was frustrated with myself more than almost anything else. God, I was chill. Rebecca and I were very good with God. And that was really reassuring for us in our walk of faith of, those things where, I hope that in a situation where I'm close to death that my faith would be strong and that, but you don't know until you're in the situation.
Sure.
And so for us to be in the situation and very confident about God being good, very confident about where we were going, we were worried about our friends and family mourning. We were worried about the physical pain we would endure, since it would be a much slower death. But in regards to who God is and where we were going, we didn't have any issues there. And then frustrated amongst the group, there was very little, for this situation, there was very little frustrations. And according to our park ranger, Kate, she said, we did phenomenal. Oh, all the other groups apparently just start tearing each other apart and sometimes physically tearing each other apart, or they choose to separate because of how frustrated they get with each other. And separation gives you way worse chance of survival in those situations. And so we were good enough that we weren't putting blame on one another. If we were, it was very short-lived and it wasn't taken personally. It was I understand you're frustrated because of the situation. And so there were times where we would have very short fuses and responses to things, and no one ever held that against anyone because we weren't taking it personally. It was just all the circumstances getting to us physically.
So it wasn't everybody else on the team coming to you and saying, why did you bring us out into the desert to die?
No, there's only
just yourself.
I'm not even going to get into that. Scott, when was the last time you were so frustrated and you had to remind yourself of God and his goodness and his promises that you can tell us about?
I think it's a fairly regular occurrence for me. I don't know if most people listening to our podcast know this, but working with people is hard. And even church people can be frustrating sometimes. And not that, their intentions are necessarily bad or anything like that, but when you're dealing with personalities, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with expectations, and then, you multiply that by 200 or so. It's a lot. And I realized a long time ago that I can never be everything everyone wants me to be as a pastor. Learning to let go of those expectations that are placed on me, but even the ones I place on myself.
Yeah.
In this story, I can relate a little bit more to Moses, I think, and his frustration with his people.
And I think you can't try and be everything to every person, because then you're failing your job. Where I've seen pastors where it's I'll tell you what you want to hear, and then you're happy in the moment, but either they don't make any changes in that direction, or they flip-flop on theology, even to that point, just to make a person feel happier with coming to that congregation.
But as pastors, we're certainly not called to be people pleasers. We are called to please God, and sometimes that means making the hard choice. Sometimes it means disappointing people, even people you care about, even people you agree with sometimes. Because even though you agree with them from your own perspective, you can see the bigger perspective, and it's not the best option
For the whole congregation.
Or for what God is asking us to do. Yeah. And so, I think frustration's a very real part of life. It's certainly a real part of ministry, but I think God is faithful, and he's good.
Amen.
And he's gracious in the midst of those frustrations. And he wants to help us. He wants to lead us. He wants us to give us guidance in those situations.
Yeah.
We just have to be willing to listen and then do what he said, right? It's not just go to God and listen to his answer. We then have to actually act on that. That's what trust looks like, right?
Yeah.
Not just receiving the guidance, but actually acting on it. That's where we see our trust lived out. That's where the rubber hits the road. I can say I trust God all I want, but if I go to him and he gives me guidance, or he gives me a solution to something, and I don't do anything with it, then I'm not really trusting him, I'm trusting myself.
And then why would he trust you with telling you specifically what to do if he already knows your heart of whether you would actually follow through?
But, and this is the beautiful thing about God, he's willing to rebuild that trust with us. And we talked about that a little bit last week in the sermon, just how God, when we have chosen not to believe him and act on what he's told us, he'll give us another chance. He's there waiting for us to confess that and repent of it, turn our hearts toward him again. But then that can sometimes take time to rebuild that trust, to rebuild the relationship, because it is a relationship. And when trust is broken, it takes time to rebuild that trust. Well, that's our conversation for today. But that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode, or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.